Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're really digging into something, a story that feels like it should be making huge waves. But maybe it's flying under the radar for most people.
I think that's a fair assessment. You know that feeling you get sometimes that something fundamental is shifting, especially in global economics, global power.
Yeah, like a subtle tremor you can't quite place.
Exactly. Well, the analysis we're looking at today argues that feeling is right on the money. It claims something massive is happening.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, right?
Yes.
To unpack this specific analysis. It presents a reported deal involving Saudi Arabia and the BRICS nations.
And it doesn't just call it significant. This source frames it as potentially world-changing, a direct hit on the U.S. dollar's dominance, the whole petrodollar system.
Which has been the bedrock for, what, half a century?
Pretty much. So yeah, the source sees this not just as news, but as a genuinely pivotal moment, something that could speed up these huge shifts in global finance and power dynamics.
So we're going to dissect those claims, really get into the arguments, the context the source provides.
And explore what it might mean for you, for all of us navigating this, well, this increasingly complex world.
Okay, so expect us to get into the specifics from this analysis. We're
Sure.
talking the history, the petrodollar origins, the geopolitics playing out right now.
And those potential ripple effects, what happens if the source is right? What could that look like globally? It definitely challenges some common narratives.
No doubt. Let's jump in. All right, Section 1. This reported BRICS oil deal, a new chapter. The source really dials in on June 2025.
Yeah, it flags that as the month Saudi Arabia officially joined BRICS plus E, which, didn't maybe get the headline attention the source thinks it deserved.
In BRICS plus, I'll just clarify, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus the newer members.
Right. Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina joined earlier this year. A significant expansion.
But the real bombshell, according to this analysis, landed in July. Reports, specifically cited from Russian and Indian outlets.
Alleging a leaked document. And this document supposedly shows Saudi Arabia quietly agreeing to sell its oil using a BRICS reserve currency.
Quietly agreeing. That's interesting phrasing.
It is. And here's the absolute kicker, the detail the source hammers home. Explicitly not the U.S. dollar.
Wow. Okay, so if true, that is monumental.
It's presented as exactly that. The source emphasizes this detail selling oil outside the dollar framework. It claims this is the first time in 50 years this has happened with Saudi oil.
50 years. Half a century. Where Saudi oil and the U.S. dollar were basically synonymous in global trade.
Tied at the hip. That link, according to the source, was the foundation or up major part of it for the dollar's global power. The petrodollar system itself.
So this isn't just a minor trade adjustment.
Not according to this analysis, no. It's framed as a direct challenge. Seismic is a word that comes to mind based on their description. A challenge to the dollar's role in energy markets.
And the source really doesn't hold back on the potential fallout, does it?
Not at all. It argues pretty forcefully that if oil trades, especially from a giant like Saudi Arabia, start moving away from the dollar systematically,
then the whole American financial empire, as they put it, could start to weaken.
That's the claim. It's not presented as a gentle decline either. The source uses the phrase, it could shatter the illusion of dollar supremacy.
Illusion. That's a loaded word. It suggests the dollar's strength isn't inevitable, just constructed.
Constructed and carefully maintained. And now, potentially facing a direct threat, the bedrock assumption of the dollar as the ultimate safe haven, the go-to currency, that could be shifting under our feet.
So for the listener, why does this matter so intensely?
Well, if this reported shift is real and unfolds as the source suggests, the entire landscape of global trade could transform, fundamentally.
Leading to instability.
Potentially unprecedented volatility, the stability we've kind of taken for granted, built on that dollar dominance, could be seriously shaken.
And that translates to real-world impacts for people listening.
Absolutely. This isn't just abstract economics. It could hit inflation rates, affect national economies, maybe even the value of your savings or investments long term.
Because the petrodollar system gave the U.S. a unique kind of economic leeway.
A huge amount of flexibility. If that system genuinely unravels, the effects won't be contained. They'll ripple outwards globally, impacting financial policies, economic well-being everywhere.
Okay, to really get the way of this, we need that historical context. Section 2. How was this petrodollar system built in the first place?
Right, we have to go back. Back to the 1970s, a really crucial time. The U.S. had just left the gold standard in '71 under Nixon.
Which basically meant the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore.
Created
Problem, right? How do you keep the dollar valuable globally?
Exactly. And the source dives into what it calls a secret deal, struck between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia around 1973-1974.
So post-gold standard uncertainty, U.S. needs dollar stability, Saudi Arabia needs...
Security, protection. It was a rising oil power. So the deal, as the source describes it, was pretty straightforward on the surface.
The U.S. offers military protection, guarantees Saudi's security in a volatile region.
And in return, Saudi Arabia agrees to price all its oil exports only in U.S. dollars. And, importantly, invests surplus oil revenue back into U.S. Treasury bonds.
That's the blueprint, the beginning of the petrodollar system.
That's how the source presents it. Deceptively simple terms, but with massive, long-lasting consequences.
So how did that simple agreement create such a powerful system? What was the mechanism?
It engineered this incredible feedback loop. The source says it created a massive artificial demand for dollars globally.
Artificial demand? How so?
Think about it. If Saudi Arabia, a huge exporter, only accepts dollars for its oil.
Right, then any country needing that oil first needs to get dollars.
Precisely. Every industrial nation, every developing country needing energy, which was basically everyone had to buy U.S. dollars first.
So it wasn't just about trade. It forced countries to hold dollars.
Exactly. It reinforced the dollar's reach, made it indispensable for global commerce. Nations built up huge dollar reserves just to function, just to buy energy. It locked everyone in.
It essentially cemented the dollar as the world's main reserve currency.
That's the argument. A perpetual demand, almost like financial gravity, pulling capital towards the U.S.
And the source acknowledges the system wasn't theoretical. It worked.
Oh yeah, it says it worked for decades. For 50 years, this petrodollar arrangement solidified the dollar's top spot.
Giving the U.S. enormous advantages.
Immense power. The ability to manage its own economy with more freedom, finance huge debts relatively cheaply.
Because the world always needed dollars to buy oil and would soak up the supply.
That's the core idea. The U.S. could, in effect, print money to pay for imports, military spending, whatever, and the global demand for petrodollars helped absorb that inflation.
It shaped the whole the financial order around the dollar.
Fundamentally, it gave America what some call that exorbitant privilege, running deficits without the same pain other countries would face.
So understanding that history, that deep dependency created over decades,
is absolutely critical to understanding why its potential unraveling now is such a big deal, according to this analysis.
These weren't just trade patterns, they were deep economic dependencies. Nations built their entire financial systems around this dollar necessity.
It wasn't just oil for dollars, it was about currency power, who sets the economic rules.
So the big question now is, if those dependencies start to break down,
what happens to the global structure built on top of them? What replaces it? That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Section 3, the geopolitics. Because this alleged deal didn't just happen out of nowhere.
Absolutely not. The source argues pretty strongly that the U.S. just doesn't have the same kind of grip on the Middle East that it used to.
A decline in influence.
That's the narrative. It points to specific events as signals of this loosening of American control.
Like what examples does it give?
Well, it mentions the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. Huge impact on perceived U.S. reliability.
Raised questions among allies, definitely.
Then there's the failure in Yemen, a conflict where U.S. involvement didn't seem to lead to a resolution, highlighting limitations.
And Iran sanctions.
Yeah, the chaos over Iran sanctions. The source suggests that despite U.S. pressure, the sanctions didn't always achieve their goals and sometimes push countries like China and Russia closer to Iran.
So the argument is, these events signaled to regional players, like Saudi Arabia, that U.S. power wasn't absolute anymore.
Or at least not as reliable or consistent, opening the door for other relationships, other possibilities.
And how did Washington react to this perceived shift, especially with Saudi Arabia looking more independent?
Well, the source claims the U.S. wasn't just sitting back. It actively tried to prevent this pivot towards BRICS aggressively.
All these. What do they offer?
Significant incentives, apparently, trying to pull Riyadh back into the traditional fold, things like major defense guarantees.
Like formal promises of security.
On a huge scale, yeah. Plus, offers of advanced arms tech, cutting-edge military hardware.
Stuff usually reserved for the closest allies.
Exactly, and even talk of NATO-style partnerships, which would mean a much deeper integrated military alliance, really tying Saudi Arabia to the West.
These sound like pretty powerful inducements trying to reinforce that old security for alignment bargain.
They're serious offers, according to the source, aimed squarely at keeping the status quo, keeping Saudi Arabia aligned.
But the core claim here is that it didn't work.
That's the dramatic turn in the narrative. The source states that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, didn't take the bait.
Despite these massive offers, why? What reason does the source give?
It claims BRICS offered something fundamentally different, something maybe more appealing to Saudi leadership right now.
Which was?
Economic security without political lectures. That's the key phrase used. Meaning, apparently, no pressure on human rights, no conditions tied to internal politics or democracy, just power.
A purely transactional relationship based on economics and security without the ideological baggage.
That's the picture painted. A pragmatic approach prioritizing national interest, economic gain, and security above Western political values, reflecting maybe a shift towards a more multipolar worldview.
So the source interprets this as Saudi Arabia, and perhaps BRICS more broadly, calling America's bluff.
Essentially, yes. The idea that the U.S. could just demand allies pick a side, that strategy didn't work here, according to this analysis.
It suggests other nations are feeling empowered to diversify. Not just Saudi Arabia.
It points to a broader trend. More countries seeking alternative partnerships, especially ones that don't come with conditions attached, that respect sovereignty as they see it.
Which implies U.S. leverage is diminishing.
That's the core argument. The traditional tools of influence aren't as effective, creating space for direct challenges, like, say, a major oil producer ditching the dollar for energy trades.
Making such a move seem not just possible, but strategically viable from their perspective.
Exactly. It signals, according to the source, that the old rules of global power might be changing fast.
All right, let's get to the heart of it. Section 4. The petrodollar's reported demise. How is this actually happening, according to the source?
The source is very direct. It says BRICS is actively breaking that cycle of dollar dominance. Not planning to, but doing it.
And it gives concrete examples. It's not just theory.
It insists it's not theory. It names names. Russia, Iran, Brazil, India, China. Major global players.
And what are they doing?
They are all trading oil in their own currencies. That's the assertion.
Trading oil directly. Say, yuan for Russian oil, rupees for Russian oil, bypassing the dollar entirely.
That's the mechanism described. Bilateral deals. Using local currencies for huge energy transactions, quietly happening deal by deal.
Russia accepting rubles or rupees, China pushing for yuan oil contracts. These are real examples cited.
Yes, presented as tangible evidence that the shift is already underway. These aren't small adjustments. They're fundamental changes in how energy, the world's most vital commodity, is being traded.
And source really emphasizes that this isn't just speculation.
It hammers that point. This isn't speculation. It's already happening. That's a direct quote from the analysis we're dissecting.
And its conclusion is stark.
Extremely stark. The collapse of the petrodollar isn't coming. It's here transaction by transaction, quietly.
Wow. Not a future event, but a present reality unfolding silently.
That's the chilling claim. Not a big bang, but a slow, quiet erosion that's already happening. Like water wearing away stone.
Hidden in plain sight almost.
That's the implication. Happening in financial agreements and trade deals, largely away from the public eye. And the source argues that quietness is exactly what makes it so potentially dangerous. It creeps up on you.
And the most worrying part of this quiet collapse.
The warning that follows. No one's ready.
No one's ready for what?
For the consequences. For this fundamental reordering of global economic power, the shift in the financial architecture. The source implies the mainstream narrative hasn't prepared people for the scale of this change.
The idea that something so huge could be happening without widespread understanding. That's quite something.
It's a sobering thought, absolutely. It forces you to ask, if this analysis has merit, what does it mean for economic stability? For individual financial security, are we prepared?
So understanding these specific examples, Russia, China, India trading in local currencies is key.
It's crucial. Because if true, they aren't just isolated deals, they're symptoms of a bigger systemic shift away from dollar necessity.
Chipping away at that artificial demand we talked about earlier.
Exactly. For you, the listener, it means recognizing the global financial system isn't fixed. It's always changing.
And these quiet transactions, if the source is right, signal a potentially massive change that needs attention.
It directly challenges that long-held assumption of the dollar's permanent reign. That's the core message here.
Okay, let's broaden out again. Section 5. The global ripples. What are the wider consequences predicted by this source?
Well, it argues the world isn't just watching this alleged shift away from the dollar. It's following.
Meaning other countries are jumping on the BRICS bandwagon.
That's the claim. It specifically lists countries reportedly applying to join BRICS, plus Egypt, Indonesia, Argentina.
Significant nations.
Yeah.
Strategically important, large economies.
Absolutely, not minor players. And it also mentions Turkey, a NATO member, showing strong interest.
So it suggests a growing movement towards this alternative economic bloc.
A rapidly growing collective, potentially forming a real counterweight to traditional Western-led economic structures.
And what does this mean for existing global institutions, like the IMF, the World Bank?
The source makes another bold claim. These institutions are losing power because of these shifts.
Losing influence. Why?
Because as alternative blocs like BRICS gain traction and maybe set up their own financial mechanisms like the new development bank nations, have other places to turn.
Places that might offer funds or support without the conditions often tied to IMF or World Bank loans?
That's the implication. Less conditionality, perhaps more focus on infrastructure without political strings attached. This potentially erodes the dominance of those post-WWII institutions.
So if they weaken, what fills the vacuum? That's a huge question for global governance.
A massive question. What new rules emerge? What priorities shape global development and finance?
Now, let's bring it back to the U.S. What specific economic vulnerabilities does the source highlight?
This is where it gets really pointed. It argues that if oil producers keep moving away from the dollar,
The U.S. loses that unique ability to export inflation through money printing. Explain that again.
okay, so historically, the U.S. could create more dollars to fund spending. That extra supply would normally cause inflation.
But because the whole world needed those dollars for oil and reserves.
That inflationary pressure was diluted, spread across the global economy, the world absorbed the extra dollars.
But if global demand for dollars shrinks significantly,
Then that inflation stays home. It hits the U.S. domestic economy directly. Purchasing power drops, stability suffers, a nasty feedback loop.
and the source predicts concrete consequences from that.
Yes, and they're pretty grim. Higher interest rates making borrowing much more expensive for everyone, including the government.
Which leads to
More debt stress. Servicing the massive U.S. national debt becomes way harder, potentially forcing painful choices.
like austerity, spending cuts.
That's mentioned as a real possibility. Cuts to public services, social programs. The source essentially declares the era of infinite credit for the U.S. might be ending.
No more blank checks, endless wars financed easily, bailout safety nets.
It suggests those days might be over. It paints a picture of a potential and potentially harsh economic reckoning for America.
And the metaphor the source uses to capture all this.
It's stark. Economic war without bullets.
A conflict fought not with armies, but with currencies, trade deals, financial leverage.
Exactly. A silent struggle over who controls the global financial system, who sets the rules, who holds the power. Fought with interest rates and currency values, not bombs.
The stakes are incredibly high.
And connecting these huge shifts to everyday life is critical. For you listening, if the dollar's role fundamentally changes, the knock-on effects could be enormous.
Trade patterns changing, impacting jobs and prices.
Absolutely. Supply chains reconfiguring, the value of savings, pensions, investments potentially impacted.
It really forces us to ask if our current systems are ready for this kind of shock.
Or if we're entering a much more unpredictable, maybe turbulent economic era that demands serious adaptation from individuals, from nations.
Okay, final section. Section 6. The media divide. This is where the source gets really controversial, isn't it?
It definitely throws down a gauntlet. It contrasts its own dire warnings with what it claims is the mainstream media's coverage, or lack thereof.
It says outlets like CNBC call it a soft realignment.
Well, CNN barely mentions it. That's the claim. A huge disconnect between the source's assessment of the severity and the reported mainstream narrative.
Suggesting a downplaying, or maybe just A different interpretation.
The source frames it as downplaying or perhaps ignorance of the true stakes. It asks why something potentially so huge would be getting such limited or soft coverage.
And it claims certain groups do understand the gravity.
Yes. While the public might be getting a diluted story, it asserts that some people know what's really going on. Specifically names oil traders, seeing the shifts in pricing and currency daily. Currency brokers dealing with the exchange rate fluctuations that reflect these power shifts.
Low.
And the elites, that rather vague but loaded term, suggesting those in positions of power, financial, political, are aware, even if it's not public knowledge.
This leads to what the source calls the checkmate scenario. What does that mean?
It suggests that the perceived silence or lack of effective response from, say, U.S. lawmakers isn't accidental.
Why?
Because according to this analysis, there is no fix.
No fix, meaning the problem is unsolvable with current tools.
That's the devastating assertion. It's not a problem you can solve by printing money or adjusting interest rates, or even with military power.
It uses those strong metaphors. You can't print a solution to this. You can't drone strike a currency swap.
Right. Meaning the traditional levers of American power, financial and military, are useless against this specific kind of challenge, this fundamental shift in the economic landscape. The game itself has changed.
And the final, chilling conclusion from the source.
This is checkmate, and most people don't even know they're playing.
Wow. A profound claim that the game of global power has shifted, maybe irreversibly, and most people are completely unaware.
It's a direct challenge to the listener, really, to critically examine where you get your information, why some narratives get amplified and others don't.
How do you assess claims this strong, especially when they run counter to what you usually hear?
Do you dig deeper, look for more data, or dismiss it? That process of evaluation becomes incredibly important in a world potentially undergoing such huge changes.
So let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a lot today, dissecting the source material.
We have, and the central thesis is pretty clear and, yeah, pretty alarming. This alleged Saudi BRICS oil deal, not just a footnote in financial news.
According to this analysis, it's a direct challenge to the dollar, to the global power structure built over decades.
Exactly. The source argues this isn't ultimately about oil prices or currency fluctuations in isolation.
It's about what?
It's about global power, fundamentally. About who gets to write the rules of money going forward. That's the real stake.
And the most provocative takeaway, the source's final word.
It's that nations like Saudi Arabia, China, Russia are, according to this view, actively building a system where the U.S., well, where it doesn't matter anymore in the same dominant way.
And if they succeed?
The source concludes with that incredibly potent line, the American century ends. A truly stark prediction.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a big question, doesn't it?
It does. As this global financial architecture potentially shifts so fundamentally, what responsibility do nations and citizens have to adapt?
And can history offer any lessons? Any parallels to past shifts in power or currency dominance that might guide us or warn us?
That's the question to ponder. What can we learn from the past as we navigate what might be a very different future?
We definitely encourage you to keep digging. Explore the history of currencies, international relations, the rise and fall of economic blocs.
The pieces are moving on the board, whether it's headline news every day or not. Staying informed critically is key.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We hope it's given you food for thought and maybe some new questions to ask.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.